Welcome back. Let's get that soundbite from President Uhuru Kenyatta when he was talking about the lockdown that was, well, we should say the restrictions that were eased sometime earlier this week.
Should the situation deteriorate and pose a challenge to our health infrastructure, we will have to revert back to lockdown. Any trends that signal a worsening of the pandemic, we will have no choice but to return to lockdown at zero option.
So a very grim warning there, just 30 seconds each, zero option.
Joe, the situation was already bad even as the president was speaking. I don't know what worse is worse, because the numbers, and if you check, you do the checklist, Francis, that you spoke about last week, when the first, the 30 days were imposed, if we follow the same checklist, we didn't meet it this time. Basically, the situation could not have allowed for a reopening. But I think there are other factors that are coming to play, and that is the economy, the situation of Kenyans. A lot of people are struggling because of either the lockdown or the deteriorating situation of the economy, because the economy has gotten worse with the COVID situation. So these other factors have come to play. What the government did this time and what the president did this time was to create two lanes. One lane, the health side, where the numbers are really doing badly. We have reports about the numbers in isolation wards increasing. And then the other lane, of course, is to how do you get the economy back on its feet. The problem that governments will encounter, and we've said this on the show, that this is the most difficult time to be a government, because you have to balance between lives and livelihoods. So I think what may be encouraging the government right now is the low mortality rate. We're not New York, we're not Italy yet. People are not dying, even with the infections going up.
Thankfully so, but I want us to move to the education one. And let's listen actually to what Professor Magoha said about the status of 2020 with regard to the education calendar.
There shall be no KCPE for the year 2020. Number two, the 2020 Standard 8 and Form 4 cohorts will sit their examinations later in the year of 2021. And number three, the school calendar of this year will be considered lost due to COVID-19. These decisions made on institutions reopening will apply to all children, including those offering international curriculum.
Call them 2020 cohorts, but we are really talking about human beings, you know.
That's right.
Kenyan children who must be dealing with a very difficult situation right now, Yvonne. People who are, you know, all set to do the exams, considering how important exams are in this country. And boom, suddenly, it's not there anymore. Not anyone's fault, but a difficult situation all the same for them.
Indeed, two things, one good, one not so good. I cannot imagine. I think Francis did the story, was it yesterday? Talking about the number of students in the country. There's 15 million altogether in primary and secondary schools. You're talking about 300,000 teachers, many of whom are in government schools, but then of course the ones who are in private schools are taking unpaid leave. There's also another story we ran tonight that maybe we don't think about, is that, you know, schools are not just about teachers, but there's also other support staff who are, you know, today wondering, okay, so that's it for the year. So what happens next? Also difficult for students, like you said, who are ready and prepared. And I'm wondering what conversations parents are now having with their candidates. You know, attend those Zoom classes, pay attention. There's no exam coming until possibly a year from today. But it's interesting because we have been saying in this country that we're trying to move our curriculum away from this one exam being the be-all, end-all, right? If you take a look at the UK, by the way, even though Magoha says that it applies to both international and local curricula, in the UK, I think they gave all the students a predicted mark, and that was based on their aggregate of performance over the years that they've been in school. And so you start to wonder, this is the country that said that one exam should not define you. So I've heard some arguments that say, so why should they have to wait, you know, a whole other year for that exam? But then you also start to see an interesting comment that was made by Magoha a couple of days ago, where he said, we would be testing teachers in this country. I mean, we all know what a COVID test certificate is. Like, we could be tested today, and I could contract it tomorrow, considering the mode of...
Or the minute after.
Or the minute after. And even when you think about it, there's, what, 300,000 teachers in the country? That would be close to $1 billion shillings just testing all of these teachers.
In 4 months, we haven't tested that many.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. We've tested 200,311 to date. We have a shortage of, you know, we're not making as much reagents as we need. So some of those things,
so we should be starting to test the teachers now if you want to open in January.
Think about it. And are you going to test the students who are 15 million of them?
And who knows what their status will be by January if you test them now. So.
You know, so just some of those issues. But I mean, I really feel for parents and their children now. If you thought the first 3 months was tough, we even talked about an increase in teenage pregnancies. We're talking about another 6 months of children being at home. That's going to be interesting.
And it could be longer. Let's listen to Dr. Lois Ombajo. He heads the infectious diseases unit at KNH. Why this was not a good idea to open schools would not have been a good idea.
Many of us would be concerned about allowing children to school at a time when the number of cases that we're reporting is rapidly increasing. So this is a time when it's probably not safe to open right now. When would it be safe to open? We need to get to a time when you're reporting a fewer number of cases, and as many of you realize, we are unlikely to go back to a normal life very soon.
Very uncertain, Francis, when we are reporting a fewer number of cases. No, we don't know what a fewer number of cases means, because, I mean, we had 447 today. Does that mean 446? Does that mean 200? So just adding to the uncertainty and underlining the fact that no one really knows how this is going to play out.
Absolutely. And when we raise that matter here on Newsgang, that time when the CS told us something about July, then September. And I mean, clearly it was not going to be possible. And we were told, I am the guy who is in charge, so listen to me. And people raised questions and said some of these pronouncements were not tenable. And clearly they weren't tenable. And even the January date still remains a projection, still remains an expectation that by that time, the situation will have, you know, calmed down, we will have found a way of dealing with COVID-19. But in the event that that is not the situation, then it means that we continue to stay with the children at home. But purely from a parenting point of view, many parents, in fact, I heard Nicholas Mayo, the chairman of the Parents Association, saying that many parents, from a survey they conducted, were saying they would rather have their children at home rather than expose them to the virus when they go to school. And we're talking about 10.8 million kids in primary schools. Those are 8.5 million in, 8.5 million in public schools and 2.3 million in private schools. These are from class 1 to class 8. These are the ones that you really need to take care of. And with the teacher shortage that we have, We also have 100% transition. So you're talking about bigger classes. There was that proposal that one class should accommodate between 15 and 20. Do we even have the infrastructure to accommodate those students? Do we even have the enough desks? Even before COVID-19, we were dealing with dilapidated classrooms and schools. Right. So where are we going to get more classes to accommodate these 15 to 20 per class? When you have a class of 64, you're talking about 3 classes from 1. Where are the teachers? We're talking about shortage of teachers every other day. Look at the secondary schools. I mean, another 4.1 million. Yeah. 3 million of them in public schools. When you talked about 100% transition, there was, bigger classes, more pressure on accommodation and other dining facilities. So it was a tall order to say kids were going back to school in January. Hopefully, there will be a solution by the time we get there, hopefully. But I'm more interested in the discussion around the fate of the many teachers, the many workers in school who have now been rendered jobless. Sikolia told us of a school, of about 15 schools that have closed, about 19 of them that have closed totally.
For good.
For good, yeah. We're also talking about in excess of 300,000 teachers and other workers in those institutions. It's a very difficult situation. Then you've also not even mentioned about teachers who are employed by boards of management in schools, BOM teachers. They're not being paid. And these were people who are earning a livelihood. And they're not even considered for the vulnerable groups fund that the government is giving. Add them to the millions of other people who have lost their jobs. So you're talking about a serious crisis in the economy. You're talking about a serious crisis in the ordinary livelihoods of people, mental health, and so on and so forth. So beyond schools not reopening, we also need to look at the people who are working in those schools and what their lives will be after this situation.
Wow, interesting. Linus, quite a mixture of things, because, when people talk about schools, continuing to remain closed, people think about students, people think about teachers, but it literally engulfs the entire society.
Every school, Joe, is a huge community. In it, there are teachers. In it, there are staff members. Let's all remember...
And suppliers, even.
Yeah, and suppliers.
Right.
Let's remember our groundsmen, for example, the guys who used to clear the bushes and tend the flowers. Cooks. Our watchmen in schools.
Drivers. Matrons, caregivers.
Those who supply eggs and all these other things.
It is a very, very huge community. So if you're talking of the economy getting worse, this is the other thing that COVID is doing, especially when when schools start closing. And the other interesting observation we have to make is private schools have really increased in number in this country because a lot of investors have decided it's the way to go. Private schools actually do better in terms of recruiting students than public schools do. Even though obviously the numbers, because of economic disparities, then there are more numbers in public schools. But when you go to urban areas, every aspiring so-called middle-class parent is looking at a private school for education of their children. And we sit here and we are parents affected by this situation. It's going to be a very, very difficult 6 months. Joe, how the government should have done differently is to buy time piecemeal. I don't find it necessary for our Ministry of Education to come out and say, for the next 6 months...
The school calendar is lost.
The school calendar is lost. Governments are elected to peddle hope. And they've done that on other issues. I don't want to talk about campaign pledges, things like, 5 to 9 stadiums. That kind of salesmanship is necessary sometimes, especially in times of a crisis like this. You don't stand in a press conference and crush the hopes of how many millions again?
16 million.
2 million candidates this year. 1.2 million and 752,000 in primary schools.
Yes. What
in
we
secondary
need to
schools,
see
actually.
From Magoha and this team increasingly is empathy. But also the question should be asked, 6 months, schools are closing. What is the ministry doing for 6 months? Are they going on leave? What are they doing?
And this is the time perhaps to increase the capacity, build, more classrooms, because now you have the 6 months to do so. Or will this be another wasted opportunity like what we've done with the healthcare system?
And that reminds me of something else, Yvonne, that the ministry ought to have delivered on. And we've seen the minister or the cabinet secretary not being very nice with schools that are doing online classes.
Yeah.
And then you have the president on one side saying we can't do business the same old ways, let's innovate. Why are we discouraging online classes? I saw we tested the Loon satellite, the Loon balloons yesterday. And there's always been a question of how do we assist the children in the countryside? Because when you look at the urban areas, there's a lot of online learning going on.
Yeah.
Just because they can be able to access internet. These are the things that the Ministry of Education needs to address itself to. How do you make online learning possible for as many as possible of those millions of students? Because you can't encourage innovation on one hand and then say, oh, that's your imaginary calendar because the time is lost. I think there needs to be either better coordination of how the government is communicating. Empathy is what people need right now, not being instructed with harsh tones and being spoken down at. A lot of parents are not happy with what is going on. Yeah. Children are, of course, in their own ways, going through a very difficult phase because of these unusual developments. So don't make things worse by talking badly on television.
Yeah, can I just add something that perhaps you don't think about when it comes to schools? For a lot of school children, the one meal they get is in school.
Yep.
For a lot of them.
Yeah.
And now they are already in distress, even before COVID, at home. So school provided an outlet, they were busy, they were staying out of crime, they were staying out of harmful behavior, and they were getting a meal to eat. Now, they're back home, where if things were bad before, they are worse now. And so there's just a lot of things to consider with that. And in so many ways, COVID is just bringing the chickens home to roost. Does anybody remember the one laptop per child program that was promised in 2013? If that had been a reality, guess what? Online classes would now be very possible. Then it moved to digital literacy program, and there's supposed to be computer labs in the schools. Maybe the children would have gone to these computer labs in shifts. I don't know, maybe have 4 or 5 in one lab at a time for a 2-hour session, and then, have that on a rotational basis. So you see, a lot of the things that we put in place and we said we would do, and we didn't, COVID-19 is teaching us the lessons.
And
and exposing us.
Yes, and you know what? It's clear to everybody that we don't know how long this is going to take. It could be much, much longer than we think.
Right.
But further to that, a lot of experts are saying we can't rule out another pandemic in the next few years. No one knows what could happen in the next 10 years, 5 years, who knows. And so just putting in place those basic infrastructural things that would help us to deal with something like this in a different way. It would be a shame, for example, God forbid, if the pandemic came back in 10 years and we still have to shut down everything, schools cannot continue because there's a pandemic. I think there has to be a learning from this that says, hey, if this thing came here 10 years from now, we will be ready for it, unless it is something else that comes from the skies or whatever it is.
My bigger worry as we wind up is how to contain the children at home. We are talking about COVID and this extra 6 months at home, yet at the same time we have been talking for the last few weeks about an increase in teenage pregnancies. This is a crisis facing us, it's very bad. And many parents that I've spoken to, their biggest challenge is what to do with their children for those 6 months or so. Some at least still have a job to do, but now the exposure. Not everybody has a house help. Not everybody has people to leave their children with, and this is a serious challenge. And I can't even start to think about drugs,
harmful behavior, crime.
It's going to